Okay, well, I'm going to get started. So good evening and welcome to Broadview's National Online Reading Club. My name is Jocelyn Bell and I'm the editor and publisher of Broadview magazine. And working behind the scenes with me tonight is Emma Prestwich, who is our digital editor, and she is also our new United Church in Focus editor. We're so glad that you've taken an hour to be with us this evening and to discuss the podcast with us. I'm speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat, the original owners and custodians of this land. Today, Toronto is home to many, including a diverse urban Indigenous community of Inuit, First Nations, and Métis. We'd love to know where you're from and who you are, so please do say hello from your hometown in the chat space. And if you're part of a faith community and want to add that as well, please do so. And if you want to add in your own land acknowledgement from wherever you are, I invite you to share that as well. It's just really great for us to know who's here and to get to know each other a bit better. So just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. I think you know from when you first entered the space that we are recording this session so that we can share the event with others. And if you feel uncomfortable with your thumbnail video appearing on this recording, then just please turn off your video now. And you can do that in the bottom left corner. Also, please mute your audio if it's probably already muted, but if we start to hear ambient noise, we may mute it for you. Also, do turn on the chat function, and that's just on the bottom of the screen, and you can hover your cursor over it and a chat button will appear, so you just click on that. I also recommend that you use speaker view rather than gallery view, and there's a spot to change that in the top right corner of your screen. This evening, we're going to do things a little bit differently. Our whole reading club is being dedicated to discussing our new podcast called And Also Some Women, which is a feminist take on well-known women of the Bible. Our guests tonight are podcast host Junia Joplin, podcast reporter, writer, and researcher Anne Thériault, and podcast producer Michael Brown. We also have two bonus guests. One is Christy Woodstra, who came up with the idea for the podcast and edited the podcast script. And the other bonus guest is Reverend John Perigo, who, along with his wife, Reverend Dr. Lillian Perigo, funded our podcast. And so we'll hear from both John and Christy as well. So to start, we're going to have kind of a panel discussion. I'll be interviewing our guests for the first part of our evening. And as questions come to mind as you're listening, just jot them down, please. And in the last 20 minutes or so, you'll have a chance to ask them. And of course, we always have a more vibrant conversation when there's lots of participation with the questions. So note your questions as they occur to you, and we will try to get it to as many as we can. So let's get started. I would just thought we should start with some introductions. And so we'll begin with Junia. And so I'm just asking you to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your background and share what your connection to Broadview was before we started making this podcast together.
Yeah, hi there. My name is Junia Joplin. A lot of people just call me June. Either is fine. Pronouns are she, her. I live here in Toronto. And I guess I've been covered by Broadview once or twice. So I have a stack. I think I might have sent one to my mother the first time I was in there. And I've enjoyed and appreciated their perspective on life and faith here in Canada. And so when they asked me to host the podcast, it came with such a well-respected name in journalism and in faith. I was excited about that. I just had my 9th anniversary in Canada a couple of weeks ago, originally from the States, down south. And for the first 7 years or so I was in Canada, I served a church out in Mississauga, and now I serve as the associate pastor of the Metropolitan Community Church here in Toronto.
Great, thank you.
That's me.
Okay, now we'll ask Anne to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Anne Thériault. I'm a Kingston-based writer, mom, Virgin Mary enthusiast, and I have been fortunate enough to work with Broadview a couple of times now. The first time was a feature about Saint Dymphna, who is like my favorite saint, so that was really fun. And I was just really thrilled to be asked to work on this podcast because I think, this is one of my favorite things, is looking at stories in a new way and taking kind of like academic ease and translating it into everyday speak.
Okay, thank you. Michael, please introduce yourself.
Hi there. I'm Michael Brown. I have my business, Messenger Bag Media, and so we have been the kind of producers behind the scenes on the recording and the audio and all of that stuff. And yeah, so we do, audio and video, graphic design, and all that fun stuff. And yeah, in terms of how I got to know Broadview, we also do work with Magazines Canada, which is a fantastic association for magazines in Canada. Definitely give it a look. And Broadview is a Magazines Canada member, and I had done a podcast interview with Jocelyn for Magazines Canada's former podcast, and that's how her and I got introduced. And then when this idea came around, we started talking, and the rest is history.
Okay, and maybe I can go back to June and Anne. Why was it important to you to be part of this project when we kind of pitched you the idea? What made you think, yes, this is something I want to spend months of my life working on?
Are there simpler ways we could direct?
Well, for me, it was
keep healthcare top of mind.
For me, it was a chance to do something that was like not related to pride or my gender transition, like it's the first time I think any kind of religious related organization has asked me to do something other than come speak at our pride service for many years. And I was feeling very kind of segregated. Like this is all people want to hear from me about. And it's the only reason people are interested in me. It's the only thing I kind of bring. And so when y'all asked me to do this, and I said, well, why me? Jocelyn, I think you said something like, well, you're a good communicator, you understand the Bible, you can grow our audience. And I thought, oh, well, so you just kind of want me for me and not for that, like the big story that I was part of a couple of years ago, which feels like the only thing in my life. So it's just really nice to know that like, I am a person outside of that story, which if you know the story, you know the story. I don't like repeating it. But some of what Anne said about taking biblical scholarship that often feels really inaccessible and making it accessible and helping people to see that these stories from scripture, that we have this habit of deciding what they're about without really examining them to see what the deeper layers of meaning are, just to shine a light on those deeper layers of meaning is something that's always meant a lot to me in my ministry and my preaching. And so to do that in this format means a lot to me.
Yeah, wonderful. And how about you?
Yeah, I mean, so many reasons. I'm always excited to like work on a project with you guys. It was so intriguing to me to learn how to do something completely brand new. I'd never done a podcast before, so I was like, this is going to be a really big learning curve, but it's going to be really interesting. And I love Bible nerdery. Like I love going kind of deep into these stories, and I love people explaining to me things that I would have completely overlooked or misunderstood or just have a different perspective on.
Great. And I'm going to throw to Christy for a second too, because Christy, you were the one who thought of the overall theme for our podcast, Women of the Bible. And you also thought about Junia and Anne as being host and researcher writer. So can you tell me a little bit about why this idea and why these two hosts?
Well, so I think the inspiration for the idea, I'm trying to remember way back in history. And the inspiration for the idea actually came from John Perigo's wife's research. And Jocelyn, you had been telling us all about the Perigos and their incredible story and all about John's wife's focus on feminist theology and her PhD. And I just started thinking, one of our most successful stories ever in the magazine, in terms of response and people clicking, was our Mary Magdalene story. And that's the one in which Anne took a deep dive into Mary Magdalene and uncovered these really fascinating insights into who she may have been, and which was very counterintuitive to what I had learned in church. I grew up I had a very varied background church-wise in terms of denominations, started in the Christian Reformed Church, moved to the United Church, eventually went evangelical Pentecostal, went to Catholic school, have been to Anglican, Presbyterian, like you name it, I have gone to that church, Mennonite, all of it. Anyway, so I had such a varied background, but there were certain perceptions that were always taught about certain people of the Bible. And I remember Anne just blew my mind with her discoveries on Mary Magdalene. And I just loved, again, as Anne and Junia both said, this new way of thinking and understanding certain biblical stories that we thought we just knew. And so I just thought, what if we did that for a whole bunch of women in the Bible and really start taking a deep dive? And so obviously that made me think of Anne, because she's so lovely to work with and such a great researcher. It really truly is she has this niche. She is the only person I thought of. And then we were trying to think of a host, and I'm a fangirl of June, and I follow her on Twitter, and I just love all the things that she has to say about theology, and I've watched her sermons and her insight. I just thought, June would add the level of theological expertise that we needed, kind of a grounding for the host, which I thought is just someone who's really solid and understands theology and the Bible and has her own church and all that kind of stuff too. That adds a certain weight and gravitas to the film in terms of expertise. So yeah, so I hope I answered your questions, but yeah, that's how it was like a domino effect. It was like one thing after another, and then everyone said yes, which was shocking and amazing and so exciting. It was like, we have the dream team. This is awesome. So yeah, it's very, very exciting.
And how did you choose the women of the Bible that we would be focused on?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all knew we wanted some that were really familiar to people. So Mary Magdalene, the Virgin Mary, and Eve, I think, are the three biggest ones that people will really know. Because you've got to have a narrative in order to have a counter narrative. But then we also wanted to do kind of a deep dive into some of the women who get kind of less of a spotlight in Christianity.
And that's where you chose people like who?
Yeah, like people like Miriam,
yeah.
that people will be like, oh, I've heard of Miriam. I know she's Moses' sister, but they might not know kind of the story of her being a prophet or really what she does. Esther, Deborah, Salome, I think, was my favorite one that we've done. That is that every time I would tell somebody, oh yeah, we're doing an episode on Salome, and they'd be like, who? And I'd be like, no, you know who she is. Like, you just don't know her name, but when you hear the story, you'll know it.
Yeah. And then how did you choose the interview subject, the interview subjects? Because you really were able to reach out to some amazing academics across North America.
Yeah. So it was a lot of researching and Googling like feminist perspective on Eve, and and then reading all the stuff that came up and reading research papers, and also we were very fortunate that some of the people that we interviewed referred us to other people that they said, oh, if you're doing an episode on this, you really need to talk to this person, which is it's so funny because of course I'm coming as an outsider to this world and I don't know any of these people, but of course they all know each other.
Yeah, I'm sure they've all been to the same conferences and rubbed shoulders quite a bit. Another question for June. The name of our podcast, and also Some Women, that was your idea, and I'm wondering if you can explain to folks where this phrase comes from.
Yeah, it's and also Some Women is a take on a line in the 8th chapter of the Gospel of Luke. It's one of those passages that it's just kind of a transitional passage that takes you from one point in the narrative to the other. And it begins by saying that Jesus was on the road. Like in Luke's gospel, Jesus spends like a good 40% of the gospel in the middle, trying to get from the northern part of where he hung out in Galilee down to Jerusalem. And he's just, meandering and meandering and meandering. He's all itinerant. And when we think of that image of Jesus, when we think of the people who were his disciples, we think of people who are named as apostles or really dedicated followers of Jesus. We think of folks like Matthew, we think of folks like John, their names like that. Peter comes up, we think later about Paul. And in this passage, it says, Jesus was traveling with these disciples. And I think the actual sentence is like, as well as some women, which just doesn't have the same ring to it as, and also some women. So Jesus was traveling at the same time with this number of women who, some of them are named. It's like Joanna, Mary Magdalene, Susanna, and then also some others. And so, when we think of disciples, when we think of apostles, when we think of notable early church leaders who, like in this case, actually bankrolled Jesus's ministry, like they were the ones who put up the money. So that Jesus could travel from place to place, which is a pretty significant, contribution. We don't always think of those names like Joanna and Susanna or Junia, for that matter, who was an apostle named in Romans, or like Phoebe, who was a deacon, or Lydia, who had a church. So there's some really notable women who, for a number of reasons, don't get their due in Scripture, and so we wanted to shine a light on them. So. And also some women from Luke chapter 8.
Yeah, you can see why it's so fitting for this particular podcast. It's great.
Also, can I just jump in for 1 second? I just
Yeah,
noticed someone Roseanne in the chat mentioned the sermon by Diana Butler Bass and Elizabeth Schrader's research. And I just want to say we interview both of them in the Mary Magdalene episode of the podcast. So if you like their work and you want to hear more,
Episode 1 is for you. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Michael, you were with Anne when she did all of her interviews, because you were making sure the sound was as good as it possibly could be. And so what are some of the challenges of, you're doing, I guess, Zoom interviews? And
yeah, so it wasn't actually Zoom, it was remote recording. But yeah, so Anne was the one who came up with like the lists of all the people to reach out to, and then I did all of the outreach, like for the interviewers and setting things back and forth. And obviously these are people all over, so we couldn't record in person. Although if you listen to the podcast, the portions with Anne and June is recorded in the same room. It's actually recorded in Jocelyn's house in her living room.
Right.
But everything else was done remotely. So Anne is in Kingston. She came in town for when we had those actual big recording days with June. But for those interviews, we used a platform called riverside.fm. So it's not riverside.com, riverside.fm. They have a free version that you can totally use. I would highly recommend it if you ever have a need for recording people. I find it does a better job than Zoom. The thing that's nice about it is that it records, and sorry to be a little technical here, but this is my technical producer mind here. It records locally on a person's device. So how sometimes on a Zoom call, someone's audio might cut out for a second here or there. As long as you aren't planning to use it live, what Riverside does is it records on their device and then uploads it when the recording is finished, so that none of those audio hiccups are ever recorded. So as long as it's not at a pivotal moment for someone speaking, because we definitely encountered, there were some times where the person's video just froze for half the call, because we had some speakers who were like, I don't even have like a mobile phone or anything like that. They were using their laptop at the university that they teach at. And so Riverside was great for that, and really good for having those separate audio tracks for recording, so that I can make sure that everything sounds nice. So yeah, it was interesting. We had a couple times where we had to change or redo things. I think that the the biggest issue we encountered was just kind of people not knowing which microphone was set to what. And I think that's something people can probably relate to
Yeah,
using Zoom.
sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, so you got the interviews done, and then the next step was for Anne to write the script. And you know, when you listen to the script, it sounds like a breezy conversation being ad-libbed by Anne and Junia. But you know, not supposed to talk about how the sausage is made, but in fact, it's a script. And Anne, could you walk us through a little bit about what goes into writing a podcast script?
Yeah, I mean, the first portion is definitely like doing the research of, you know, whenever we had a guest, I wanted to read everything that they'd written about the subject, and then forming the questions, interviewing the guest, and then going through the transcript of the interview and figuring out like, okay, out of all of this information, what can I pull out as like quotes that is going to help tell the story that we want to tell. And then once I would get kind of all of my quotes in line, then I would build the script of what June and I were going to say around that. And, you know, some of it was like funny stuff. Some of it was, you know, if the quotes were like a bit denser and harder to understand, then explaining it. And some of it was, you know, if there was information that I had learned that I found really, really interesting, but I just like couldn't fit a big quote in about it, then it would be me saying like, oh, and also this person said to me this thing that I found really interesting, and try to sum it up as best as I could.
Yeah.
I'll also just quickly jump in and say that, yeah, in the interviews, Anne did so much research for every, like, it was insane, because we had multiple times where people would, especially for some of these that were cold outreach to the interview subject, right? They would, you know, say, okay, sure, I'll do it. And they're sort of not sure what to expect. The ones where they were referred by another colleague, that's a different story. But then when we would send the questions in advance, you know, a day or two before, so they could prepare, we would get these emails back, or when we did the recording, they'd say, whoa, that was when I knew, like, you weren't just like a little serious, you were like so serious. The questions were so well researched and so well thought out. And I think that's partly why it's such a great success, because of Anne's great research and the answers we're then able to get out of the interview subjects.
It's great. So Christy, the next step then was editing the script. And I know that you're a huge podcast fan. And so what's different for you, or what did you bring to your knowledge of podcasts from listening to them? What did you bring to editing the script from that? And how is it different from editing features, which is what you normally do at Broadview?
Well, that's a very nice way to say I'm an addict. It was known at the magazine, if you needed a recommendation on a podcast, you come to me.
Absolutely.
So I mean, just like Anne, it's one thing to listen to podcasts, but it's a whole other thing to all of a sudden be editing and working on one. And so before Anne and started even writing the first one, you know, she and I talked at length about, you know, what's this going to sound like and look like? And, you know, because you could do an interview style podcast, you could do like a highly produced with, you know, street sounds and all this kind of stuff. Like, how many people do we want to interview? Like, all that kind of stuff. It's down to the nitty gritty. And so, you know, I said to Anne, like, how are you? What does it sound like in your head? I think I asked her, what does it sound like to you? And do you think of a certain style of podcast that we could, you know, kind of emulate in terms of structure? And she immediately said 99% Invisible. Highly recommend it to everyone. It's a fantastic podcast. And immediately I totally agreed. I thought, yeah, that's a great idea. It's a great way to weave in, you know, interviews or quotes from experts, but also for the hosts, a host and a reporter, to have that banter back and forth to explain certain things where you need to. And so, yeah, it was a perfect idea for how to structure it. And so, Yeah, so honestly, we were learning as we went, to be totally honest. And so we were like studying transcripts from other podcasts to kind of understand, how often do you go back and forth between the host and the and an expert clip? How long are expert clips? Like how, and one thing I remember from radio class with Stuart McLean back in at TMU back in the day. He always said, read your scripts, like read them out loud. And you actually are supposed to do that when you're editing, even for print, which I, actually don't do and should. But so it was really key for me to read the script out loud and to hear what it would sound like. And then I was able to think, okay, we need a break here, or maybe we need, it would be better if the hosts explain this instead, or something like that. So it was really kind of Anne and I just working back and forth. But to Anne's credit, she made it quite easy in that she delivered all of the quotes already there, and it wasn't me saying, "Oh, we need to go back and re-interview people." Like it was there, the structure was there. It was really just kind of like there's different stages of editing and feature editing, and you kind of sometimes you get to jump right to a line edit, sometimes you have to restructure a little bit, but we were never starting with a really rough first draft. Like it was never we got a lot more work to do by any means. So that was so yeah, it was quite and in some of the experts, it was one of the experts was a friend of June's, like June knows a lot of theologians as well, and so it was great to be able to add those personal touches that you actually don't usually do in features. Like you don't say, "Oh, this is a friend of mine," and so it was nice to, like, there's a certain intimacy to audio that you can have that freedom to break some of the journalism rules, or that we have for print. It's a little bit more stoic. So so that was nice. It was really nice to add these little personal touches. Or I love Anne's memories of her traumatized sister watching a certain Disney movie that comes up, and you get to add these little anecdotes that you would never get to do in print. So yeah, so some fun stuff. It was really, it was trying at times, like just for myself, because I'm like, I don't know how to do this. Like, what am I doing? So I just had to kind of breathe a little bit and be like, okay, this is just like, maybe editing a feature that's a different style or different format. So I don't talk myself off the ledge. I'm like, no, you can do it. You can do it. Yeah. So it was just, it was, yeah, just kind of using all the same skills, but for a different format. And it did make it a bit easier in that I am an addict. So I was able to hear things as I was editing, because I do listen to so many podcasts.
Yeah.
It is not easy. It's really hard.
Yeah. 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 It was new for all of us, except for Michael, who of course has made podcasts before. I want to get into the content a little bit, and remembering that only the first 3 episodes are out and everybody here hasn't heard 4 and 5 yet. June, could you tell us a little bit about like some moments that surprised you as you listened? What were your aha moments, I guess, from the interviews that just, things that clicked? What was really special for you?
Well, I think one of my favorite things has been the recurring theme of, whether in the text itself or in the history of interpretation, so many of these women there have been attempts to kind of like downplay their contribution or discredit them, or make them less important or less authoritative than they ought to be in the story. And yet, this is the great thing about, I think, Scripture, is that you just can't keep them down. The more you look at them, the more you realize, oh, they're actually, there are clues and signs about their significance. There are pictures of ways we might understand them better, where they've been misunderstood. And it's all just right there. And once you see it, you can't unsee it, which is, I think, one of my favorite things about it. And, there are characters that even as someone who's been studying the Bible for decades, my seminary diploma's got a little bit of dust on it at this point. So like, it's always nice to see new scholarship through new lenses. And there are characters we've talked about, Jezebel, Delilah, who are, I think, actually, I love those two now. Like, after listening to the episode on them, like, wow, they're not as, I mean, yeah, okay, they're depicted as villains. They do kind of play a villainous role, but like, they're just really strong, self-sufficient women. And it's kind of interesting that, they should, that should be the thing that makes them villains. So,
Yeah.
it's almost like they deserve like their own version of like the Cruella movie or Wicked or something like that, where like there's some recasting of who they are. So that's been kind of my big takeaway so far. And, to hear things about a story that I've been hearing for a long time and studying for a long time and preaching and stuff like that, and to say, oh, I never heard that take on it before. That doesn't happen for me as often as it used to. And so it's always delightful when those moments come.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Disney needs to mine more of these stories of these women for their next movies.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite episode, June?
One of the forthcoming episodes where we talk about Eve, I love that story. I love, because when you talk about, here's a story that we've decided what it's about, and what we've decided it's about is actually nothing at all about what it's about. Like the story of these two people whose names are not Adam and Eve, but just two people who are called like mortal and liver or something, like a live one or something like that, or mother. And we've decided, okay, those are proper names. Like Adam is a name, Eve is a name, and they're not. And that it just, that's probably the one that is the most familiar story in the Bible that we're sure what it's about, and what we're sure it's about is so wrong. And so that's the one I'm always trying to say, look, you don't know what that story is about, I promise. And so so that's the one, like, that's kind of my personal favorite. But then, like, in listening to it, the one that I took the most delight in, like the surprises and stuff, was the Bad Girls of the Bible episode. Love that one.
Okay. Well, stay tuned. Lots to come. How about you, Anne? Favorite moments, things that surprised you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Jezebel story was the one that surprised me and intrigued me the most, because I kind of went into it thinking like, okay, maybe we'll see Jezebel through a different lens, but there's definitely not a version of the story where she's not a horrible villain. So I was really interested that Amy Kalmanovsky, who I interviewed about her, did kind of make her into maybe not the hero of the story, but like human and relatable, I think.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a favorite? So is that your favorite episode then, the whole Bad Girls episode, or do you have a favorite one?
I think my personal favorite was the Virgin Mary episode. Not that I want to choose among any of my children, but yeah, that one, that as someone who grew up in the Catholic Church, that was that's a story that I thought I really knew, and then to have people tell it in a different way was really interesting to me. And also it was like very exciting for me to interview a nun.
Yes, and that's Sister Barbara Reed, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. She's well known. So I was just thinking, I just want to check my time here for a second. I guess June and Anne, if there's something that you want people to get out of this experience of listening to the podcast, what is it? And whichever of you has an answer, just jump in.
I guess I hope that it makes people reapproach these stories with an open mind, and not that we're necessarily saying that these interpretations are the correct ones, but I think they're really interesting and thought-provoking, and I hope even people who aren't necessarily people who have faith or belong to faith communities find something interesting in it.
Absolutely. June, what do you hope you take away from it?
I hope that there are women out there who maybe they belong to faith communities, or they used to belong to faith communities, or they've had an interest in Christianity and the Bible, and have maybe struggled to find strong characters to relate to. I hope that they can see that they're there, you know, and maybe hear things about them that humanize them and points to their significance that maybe they haven't heard before. Really, I think one of the most moving moments for me, and Anne and I, we were kind of talking about the Virgin Mary episode as being one of our favorites, but and I haven't mentioned this to you, Anne, but like the segment where you talk about mothers naming their daughters Mary, saying, you know, maybe she can be a prophet, maybe she can be a leader, maybe she can be someone who helps to inspire and liberate her people. That expression of hope for little girls, just, I mean, it almost brought me to tears, because the church needs more of that. And so I hope that this podcast, our podcast, can bring just a little touch of that into the world, because it's still kind of lacking, I'm afraid.
Well said. Shortly, I'm going to open the floor for questions, but there's one more very special guest that I want to introduce, and that's John Perigo, who, along with his wife Lillian, as I mentioned, funded this podcast with a very generous gift to Broadview. John, can I invite you to say a few words about your involvement with this podcast and why you decided to do this? Oh, you have to get off mute just a second. You're on mute, John, just a second. Let's make sure you're off there. Can you find the button? There
I found it.
Yep, you're good.
Thank you. So I wish Lillian were here. And she's not, because there's an outbreak at Einegraft Engage Home, an institution set up by the United Church in 1931, at the worst part of the Depression. But she's in long-term care, and they have a COVID outbreak, and that's the kind of thing which causes everybody to just go into terrors, you know. So I had hoped that she would be able to be part of it, and she would love this banter back and forth between such outspoken but highly trained women. I guess what I want to say first of all about it is that Lillian approaches life as a teacher, not really just as a, well, I shouldn't say just, but not even principally as a minister. She was a teacher for 20 years. She taught high school kids. She taught them about their literature, particularly the fine novels of Margaret Lawrence and W.O. Mitchell and who did Danny Kravitz. Anyway, she taught about these things, and she needed to do deep dives into their situations in order to help kids, many of whom, of course, and so we're talking about her teaching career, which was 65 to 85. They were they didn't have a lot of the history, neither the and so it was what we did was, at that time there was an onslaught of something called the scrapbooks. And scrapbooks helped us understand our history, and Lillian decided it should also be a way to teach kids about their literature. And so she put together a series of books that were derived on the premise that we could explore the world of the novel, and that so into a deep dive for that, and it worked extremely well. I mean, the teachers enjoyed it, the kids enjoyed it, but probably one of the most spectacular things was the way that Margaret Lawrence herself responded to these books. She said, "This is fine work and you've really done a job." Well, Lillian was just over the moon, as you can probably imagine, to have Margaret Lawrence write a letter to her saying, and not only that, I want to tell one of my best friends who is who's in Toronto, Clara Thomas. Just couldn't remember. Clara Thomas was the head of the English department at York while we were there. And I think Clara already knew what Lillian was doing. But the deep dive into this was so exciting. And we wanted to see that the same kind of deep dive, however it would come out, whatever the format would be decided by a publisher who would keep it in words or salt it with words and pictures or make a podcast out of it. I do remember talking to you about it in the very early going, and I said I think podcasts are the way to grab people. And you said, it sounds right, and let's see what we can do with that. And Lillian and I just said, hey, go for it. This is wonderful, and let's just keep it rolling.
Yeah. I appreciate your support so much, John. Thank you. It's been great for all of us. And yeah, thank you. And please, when you see Lillian next, when the lockdown lifts at Inagraft Engaged, then please give her our thanks as well. So I'd like to open the floor now for those who may have questions. I see a few comments of people being excited about the podcast, so it's great. I should say, this is maybe basic, you can find out more information at broadview.org/podcasts. And if you've never listened to a podcast before, that's okay. You can just go to that website and click play. There's a play button right on the website. So other people may get the podcast by downloading it on their favorite app, and that's the other way to do it. So there's a couple ways to ask questions that Emma has posted. And maybe while we're just waiting for some questions to come in, Michael, you could tell us how how it's being received, the podcast, because we've had some good success so far.
Yeah, for sure. No, it's been very successful. So in total, we're sitting at about 6,500 total downloads. That does include our trailer. So for the actual episodes so far, which we have our first 3 episodes at about 5,000 downloads, which is really fantastic. We have been on Apple Podcasts in the religion and spirituality category, in the top 10 shows there. So really, it's performing very well. Anne has a very active Twitter following, and I've seen, fantastic comments there and things like that. Like, especially on day one, I mean, this has been one of the things I initially said to Jocelyn when we were starting this was like, there are a lot of podcasts. Christy, the addict, can probably attest to it. There are so many podcasts that exist. Asking someone to listen for a long, long time is probably going to be a harder sell now, whereas coming in with 5 really sharp, dedicated episodes will perform better. And so we spent so long working on it that when episode 1 came out, it was so nice seeing the reaction of people being excited. And tonight, seeing people in the chat who are also now, intrigued and interested. it's really fantastic. But yeah, the reaction has been great. The download numbers are very good, and I think it's the kind of podcast where you can go back and listen to it, you know, in a year, or if you haven't listened to it, you can. But like, it's something that will age well, and that you could listen to it again yourself down the line.
Yeah. And I should also mention, we've created a resource for groups. If you want to listen to it as a group and then have discussion, we've created some discussion questions, which are also available at the same spot, broadview.org/podcasts. And so there's about, 3 to 5 discussion questions for each episode. And that was produced as a result of people asking for that resource. So we've done that. Michael, can you talk a bit about podcasts more generally? What it's a relatively new medium. I say that from somebody who's working.
Yeah, it's older than you think. It's older than you think. So podcasts
Okay.
have been around for about, well, I mean, technically they've been around for like 23 years, but really in popularity, they've been around for just shy of 20 years when Apple introduced podcasting at a podcasting sort of, store or library on like the iTunes platform. And then they really started to pick up around 2013 was when the first big wave of podcasts. There was definitely stuff before that. I've been podcasting since like 2006 in various capacities. But it started then. And then now in Canada specifically, again, just from a survey report that I've been reading. So now Canadians 18 or older, 53% have said that they have ever listened to a podcast, and 34% of people say that they listen to a podcast at least monthly. It's a really like kind of intimate way of consuming content. Like you're doing other things, but it can become a part of like your routine or your ritual, whether that's when you're commuting somewhere, or maybe when you're cooking or you're doing your gardening. And so podcasting is sort of a way where you're doing these other things, but you're actively hearing these voices going into your ears, and then you sort of develop a relationship with who the hosts are, with the voices. It probably sinks in a little deeper than if even you're watching TV. And that's also like found true to be the case, right? So yeah, those are some stats on podcasts.
Okay. Well, we do have some questions in the chat now, so I'll start. Christy is asking which of the women, if we had season 2, which women would you want to cover? I'll throw that to Anne.
I think one I would definitely love to cover is Bathsheba. I never know if it's Bathsheba or Bathsheba. I always say it wrong. But David's wife, who is also the mother of Solomon, because she's a very important and interesting queen. And I mean, it's a little scandalous how she and David get together, which I like all of the scandalous Bible stories.
June, how about you? Who would you, who would be your season 2 first pick?
First pick for season 2?
Yeah.
I think it would be interesting just to do sort of a grab bag of women leaders from the New Testament, sort of like our like heavy hitters. The forthcoming episode on like Old Testament heavy hitters, like New Testament heavy hitters. So we could do Phoebe and Priscilla. We could do Lydia, and we could talk about Junia, which is, I like talking about Junia since she's since I'm named after her. So I like those sort of grab bag episodes because a lot of them don't have a very highly developed narrative, but they were there and they were pretty important.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I love Anne's idea though.
Yeah. Leaf is asking if we have any plans to explore the idea of God having a gender or a neutral gender on the podcast. Anne, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in the Eve episode, we do get into the idea that Adam, before Eve is split out from Adam, sorry, I hope this isn't a spoiler, but we get into the idea that Adam is non-binary or kind of all gender, encompasses all genders before God creates man and woman. So I think that's really interesting. But yeah, I find that idea really fascinating, and I would love to get into kind of a nitty-gritty discussion about how we gender God.
Yeah.
An episode on God would be really interesting. Like I almost said that after seeing that question in the chat. Like I think episode 1 of season 2 should just be about God. One of the most overlooked women in the Bible.
Okay, thank you. So Donna is saying that some of the church women got together to listen to the first podcast. It was awesome and the discussion was super, and thank you for the discussion questions, which Isabel from the church had requested. Yes, that's right. I remember speaking with Isabel. So yeah, I'm glad that worked out for you, Donna. Did you want to say anything more about how that went for your group, or recommend the discussion group idea to others? You can just
Sorry. I don't know that I have any recommendations, but thank you. It was such a good thing to do together, and the discussion went on and on and on. I mean, your question started it, and we just kept going. So thank you so much.
Start the ball rolling. That's what I like to hear. Yeah.
Thank you.
And then Ray LeBeau says he will give everyone in his church the link to the podcast. That's great. Thank you, Ray, for doing that. Michael, you have a question.
First, I wanted just to say that I've been really enjoying it, and thank you very much for this, and congratulations on a really successful new initiative with this. My question was sort of a structural, I guess, kind of compositional one. I know Christy had spoken to this a little bit about things that you can do in an audio format that you can't necessarily in written. And I'm wondering if sort of folks on the team can elaborate on that a little bit about other aspects of audio versus sort of written journalism, and how much the lessons from one sort of do or don't apply to the other. Is the practice of kind of assembling a narrative in audio, have you found that to be quite a different process from how it would be in a written format?
Michael, do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. Well, so the interesting thing too, and now I'll also let Anne speak to it as well, because she was the one who was taking the, transcripts from the interviews, but we produced 5 episodes. Obviously 3 are out now, the 4th is out tomorrow, but 5 roughly 30 to 35 minute episodes, and each interview that we had with each of the guests on the podcast was about 40 minutes to an hour long, and we condensed all of that into much less. So it's I think there's definitely a lot that doesn't get heard, but I think there's some transcripts that are available. And then in terms of kind of thinking of with audio, I think in episode 1, there's probably the best example of it, which is when, we hear from Elizabeth Schrader-Pulitzer about who used to, be a musician. She talks about how she wrote a song about Mary Magdalene. It's nice that in that time when she's talking about it, we get to hear it for a little bit, and credit and thanks to her for also letting us use it on the show, but we get to hear some of that a little bit, and then it ducks down a little bit. It's still playing, it sets the ambiance. So I think there's times where you can use music or sound to underscore certain things, and it was a lot of fun getting to play with that here, which you wouldn't normally get in a printed publication.
Mark has an interesting question about how we would sell the podcast to folks who may not be familiar with the Bible at all, and what angle should they approach the podcast from. And that's a really interesting question, because we thought, we had a lot of discussion about audience, because the people we interviewed were theologians, and so they are accustomed to speaking to theological students. Our readers, have a generally a good grounding in biblical stories, and so we're trying to speak to that audience. But I'd be interested, Michael, from you, because as we were putting this together, and from Anne, but as you're putting this together, you shared with us that you don't have a background of biblical knowledge at all, and so what is it about this podcast that you've been able to connect with?
Totally. Yeah.
Sorry to put you on the spot, but
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's fine. I've been to church like only a couple of times ever. And it was really mainly when my parents were out of town and I was staying with neighbors, right? And they were, so I really came in with like no knowledge, but that was what interested me so much about this project was about, I thought it would be a really good way to sort of open my mind and hear so many more. And I love the angle for the podcast. And again, from the interviews, which have then obviously been condensed into our episodes, I think that Anne and June do a great job of explaining and sort of making sure that we can go deeper, but that it's still approachable for anyone who doesn't necessarily have that background, doesn't have that knowledge. And we sort of release the episodes in a way where that's structured. Like I think Mary Magdalene's like a really good first episode to do it and get in on. Because yeah, when we were doing some of the interviews, there were definitely times where we're done. And again, Anne's got all of the knowledge. She's done so much of the research. And afterwards we'd be done and I'd be like, whew, okay, well, like there's a lot that I didn't understand there or like had never heard before. And yeah, I think this podcast definitely provides a good window in or a ground floor. And I certainly found it to be that way. And that's not just because I've listened to the episodes like 20 times each. So
yeah, well, and we've structured it intentionally that the episodes start with the basics. What are the basics of this story? Even if it's as famous a story as Adam and Eve, we give the basics of the story so that anybody coming at it can understand. And then the counter narrative, as I think Anne put it really well. So the narrative and the counter narrative. So that's the way it's structured on purpose so that people can not feel like it's not for them or they don't understand it because they don't have the basics. I am going to wrap us up, but I invite all of our guests and everybody who's here to stay for a few minutes afterwards. There were a couple more questions in the list that I didn't get to, just for an informal time of chatting. And but for those who need to go, I'm just going to do my quick wrap up. So thank you so much to everybody for being here tonight, and particularly to June, Anne, and Michael, who volunteered their time to make this event possible. We're so grateful to you. And of course, we're also very grateful to Christy, who edited the podcast and spoke about her work tonight. And none of it could have happened without John and Lillian Perigo, whose gifts to Broadview are making many, many wonderful things happen at Broadview these days. So thank you to you all. Tomorrow, we'll be sending you a short survey by email so you can share your thoughts with us about the event. Broadview's online reading club is a free event, but it does cost us $3,000 per year for a Zoom plan that can handle a group event of this size. So if you're already a donor to Broadview, thank you. If not, please consider making a small donation for tonight's event. And Emma will post a link for donations in the chat, and we'll also include a link to donations with tomorrow's survey. So like I said, if you're able to spare a few more minutes of this evening, please stay online at the end of our program and we'll chat more informally. And otherwise, if you need to be on your way, thank you again for being here. Be well, and we hope to see you back at our next online reading club on July 10th at 7 p.m. Eastern. And Emma Presswich will be your host, and we'll be discussing stories in the July-August issue. So thank you, everyone who has to go. And for those who want to stay, we'll just keep chatting for a while longer. And at this point, I mean, I can just go back to the questions, because I think Nathan had an interesting question about lessons learned. We can go, everybody can come away with lessons learned, I'm sure. Anne, do you want to start? Any lessons learned?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, I did not know how hard it was going to be or how much work it was going to be. So I would budget more time for it next time. Yeah, I think that was my biggest one. There's stuff that I would like to do differently. Like I would like to have more diversity, even in stuff in terms of like age. Like I would love to get more younger people on, because I feel like the guests skewed a bit older, and so I would love to get like a bigger age range of who we're talking to.
Okay. June. Lessons, thoughts?
You know, I've been asked to be on a lot of podcasts. It's been a little while, but and I've had one or two folks approach me to talk about like starting a podcast, and I've always said no. Like everybody's got a podcast, and so I never really thought of myself as a host, and was a little reluctant for that reason at the beginning. But you know, I learned I really enjoy doing this. I've been a fan of Anne's. It's especially Anne's Twitter presence for years. She's one of my favorite follows, and so when I saw I'd be working with her, I was very much starstruck. So that was I you know, getting to learn what it's like to work with somebody who's you know, there's a lot of smart people out there, but when you run into somebody whose, you know, intellect gets fired up by some of the same things that yours gets fired up by, especially when they're sort of out of the mainstream, that's a really wonderful experience. So and yeah, I guess I've learned that there's a nice appetite for this stuff out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's been a wonderful learning for us too. And I can attest to how well you two clicked together, although you hadn't met before we started this project, you know, because you were recording in my dining room. Just, you know, the conversation continued after the recording had stopped, and, you know, Anne and June just love talking, nerding out on Bible stuff, as Anne would put it. So it was really great to see. Michael, lessons learned for next time if we had a season 2.
Oh, yeah. So, okay, maybe 2 things. One's maybe like a little more technical, but so I mentioned Riverside.fm as the platform we used to record, and it was super great. So it can record the video and the audio, but again, it records that locally on the device, so that can take up a lot of space and it can use a lot of internet bandwidth. So for pretty much all of our interviews this time, we just did the audio only, just because, you know, we didn't sort of pre-check with our interviewees like, can your internet handle that? And I think it would have been great if we did have the video, because then maybe we could repurpose some of these into additional clips, additional ways to get the content out of it. Some people might want to sit at a computer and actually watch, you know, snippets of these conversations or something. So that might be one thing. And then the other was, we did episode 1 as sort of a pilot, you know, it was at the tail end actually of 2022. And then from there, we did all the other 4 sort of in quick succession. So when Anne's talking about having that time crunch of writing everything, it was because we sort of tasked her, again, we all a little naively were like, yeah, doing 4 episodes practically at once, that makes sense. So, you know, maybe space that out a little bit more. I think it's great releasing them all in a row, but maybe having them all in the bag a little earlier next time will be something we can do. But again, this was our first time doing this all together, so maybe next time it just works because we've done it all and it's worked fantastically now. So
Yeah, you take your best guess when you're making a schedule, and then things take longer. That's kind of a general rule of almost every project I've ever been involved with. But Christy, what about you? Any thoughts, lessons learned that you would take forward to another season?
Well, I think we just learned from Michael that we need to have the outtakes of June and Anne's discussions after the podcast is recorded for even more discussion. What would I don't know. Honestly, like, I feel like I think we learned so much in the process of making this, like that the next one would be, I don't want to say easier or smoother. Like, I mean, it was, because that makes it sound like this one was really rough. And there were definitely challenges. Like Anne said, like we expected, like not expected, we set really tight timelines for not knowing how much work it was going to be. And I think that was a lot on Anne in particular. And, you know, and then even recording them back to back, and then it was, or in one shot, was then a lot on Michael to edit really quickly. And, you know, and then we also wanted to provide transcripts, like, you know, that was kind of an afterthought in some ways. Oh my goodness, we need to have transcripts of the podcast, because some people can't listen to podcasts. It's either aggravating or they can't pay attention. And so we want to be inclusive in that way too, and have transcripts. of everything. So, which we do have for anyone who prefers to read the transcript rather than listen to the podcast. So yeah, I feel like we thought of a lot of things along the way that, you know, have been more helpful to think of ahead of time, but how would we have known? Yeah, I think I discovered, you know, as much as I had a lot of self-doubt on, you know, could I edit this? I discovered how much I loved it. Like I absolutely love editing this, and you know, in just dissecting how podcasts are structured and put together, and as Michael said, layering, you know, just a little bit of music or sound over top of, you know, you don't realize how long a minute is, or even, you know, 3 minutes. You know, and being able to add just a little bit of music or a little pause here and there in between the question and the answer can and just get people's attention. And you know, and so just I learned so much about how we listen and how we hear a story versus how we read a story. And so that was, for me personally, was really rewarding, and it's such a privilege to work on this. And yeah, anyway, so that's, I think, definitely we're going to have outtakes of June and Anne talking afterwards, and their discussions are what we're allowed to listen in on. Roundtable discussions. And I think too, you know, like Michael said, having a little bit more production time in planning this, and not putting so much pressure on Anne.
Well, and when did we start? We started it in the fall, and with the idea of having it out around Easter, and then we actually hit May, which is okay. But this is a, you know, it took months, it's months of work, and especially for Anne. I mean, like you said, Christy, the bulk of it was Anne's work. So, Alan, the transcripts, they're at broadview.org/podcasts. Everything is on that webpage, broadview.org/podcasts. Transcripts are on the opposite. Yes, that's true. On the episode pages, then you can get to it from there. Emma, do you just jump in with your question?
I have to put a spotlight on myself. Yeah, this is a question for Anne and or June, whoever has some thoughts on it. I was wondering if there were any thoughts or conclusions from the guests that really challenged you, or that you disagreed with when you heard them, or that you still disagree with in some way.
There was one, I saw your question in the chat and had to think about it for a second, because, you know, my first instinct was to say not really, but there's an episode where we talk about Deborah a bit, and you know, Deborah appears in the book of Judges, which is a very, there's sort of a, Judges is just kind of known for well, and actually Delilah's in Judges too. Samson and Delilah are in Judges, and there's just lots of violence and like tribal infighting, and it's during a period of time when, you know, the people of Israel didn't have like a king, and it's just a very messy period in its history. And someone, I think, suggested that maybe, but you know, out of that, there are some kind of heroic figures, and Deborah is one of them. There's this kind of military general who's a woman, and one of the guests suggested that like the authors of Judges were maybe trying to say things were so bad we actually had to have a woman run the army, and thank God that we're past that. And I was like, oh, well, that sort of reframes it in a way that I'm not a fan of, because there's certainly some really, not in that story, there's a couple of women, Deborah and Jael, who are the heroes of the story. I guess it's challenging in a way that I'm still kind of figuring out what to do with it, but just the comprehensive throughout the scriptures, the way like sex work is used as like the metaphor for sinfulness, from like the first page to the last page. And like, so I really appreciate about some of what we did with Mary Magdalene, who's, you know, that isn't really even a sex worker in the text, just like one of the popes just decided to make that up. Because I guess when you're pope, you can make stuff up about the Bible. But I could almost see us doing an episode on just like all the sex workers in the Bible from like Genesis to Revelation, and ask ourselves, like, why is that? Why does that become like the go-to metaphor for unfaithfulness and sinfulness, and what can we learn from that? I don't know. I think that would be an interesting episode, and challenging work to do, because I'm still kind of learning what to do with sex positivity in faith spaces.
Thanks.
And what about you? Did you have any things that you felt very challenged by or didn't agree with?
I think this is something I felt challenged by. I wouldn't say I disagreed with it, but AJ Levine, who we interviewed for the Virgin Mary episode, she has written about and spoke to us about kind of the modern progressive interpretation of Jesus as a feminist, and how, from her perspective, it really relies on some anti-Semitic tropes that, from her perspective, kind of often the narrative is that, things were so bad for women in first century Judea and Galilee that, even the fact that Jesus spoke to women or acknowledged that women existed is evidence that he's a feminist. And she said, that really relies on this very negative interpretation of life in Judea and Galilee, specifically Jewish life at that time. And it's definitely, like, I want Jesus to be a feminist, and maybe he was, maybe maybe it just was not recorded by the gospel writers, who were all men. But that really gave me something brand new to think about, and I have thought about it a lot ever since.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my own experience of it was that, even if I thought some interpretations were like very, very, very new to me, and felt like, is this a stretch? Is this, even if I kind of had that, like, this feels like it's on, coming from left field a bit for me, from what I know. I also thought, well, yeah, but it's making me think about it in new ways. It's making me engage with the text again, which I haven't done for a while. And it's making me interested in these characters again. And, even if I ultimately don't agree with what is said by the theologians, that's okay, because now I've just had the joyful experience of, being challenged and having little things in my brain shift a bit. So I think that's kind of the experience that I hope people take away from it. I'm not saying these are the only interpretations, these are the right interpretations, anything like that. We're saying here's some really interesting interpretations. So yeah, I'm curious to know from the people who are still here, if this is your first podcast that you've listened to, and if so, if there's anybody that wants to volunteer that's their first podcast, and what their experience was like to have that, to listen to the podcast for the first time. Anybody fit the bill that's left? No? Okay.
It's sort of like recorded radio. It's radio on demand, sort of, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's like a radio program.
I can definitely say it's not my first podcast.
We know it's not your first podcast, Chris.
I'm just joking.
Yeah.
But it's, I think one of the reasons why I love podcasts so much is just I'm a longtime listener of CBC radio. And so for me, podcasts is just an extension of really great radio storytelling. So if anyone is a fan of CBC radio, Radio 1, you can also be a fan of Radio 2.
Mm-hmm.
But in that type of storytelling, which is very mixed depending on the programs that you like. There are, if there is a certain program you like on CBC, there's definitely a podcast out there that'll be similar to it. And hopefully this kind of hits that CBC bar. I think it does in terms of journalism. So so if anyone's familiar with the radio, probably gonna like podcasts.
think we're all familiar with the radio for sure.
Just not everyone likes the radio. No, I
Yeah.
don't want to make any assumptions.
David, do you want to just jump in and ask your question? I don't need to read it for you if you want to just, this is kind of informal discussion time. So David Lee.
This has been very interesting. It is not my first time here. This was a somewhat different take on other ones that I've listened to. But I was wondering, as the discussion proceeded, it focused, it seemed to me, on the views of those, the intentions, feelings, hopes, perhaps, of the people who were doing the preparing, which is fair enough. And it was very interesting. But is there a sense of what the entity is that is being described, or towards which we're heading? Is it some version of Christianity, an updated, a renewed one, or some different in somehow, or is it some new way of living? What is the effect of what was said and mooted tonight on someone with very little knowledge of living with what I call spirit? Or what types of effects would either rejoice you, who worked so hard on this, or disappoint you? Are you getting the kinds of response, not from yourself or your colleagues, but from others and outside, that make you feel that you can look ahead to something going in the right direction? And I guess then, what is that direction?
Well, that's a big
That's
question.
a big one. It's probably
that's a big
a
question.
meeting in itself. But
I mean, I think, Anne, maybe you could talk about, because Anne does have a very big following on Twitter, and that's one way where she is communicating with a lot of people. And June, from your congregation, you might talk about some of the effects, but do either of you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, so far, the response that I've had has been overwhelmingly positive. I mean, maybe people just aren't telling me criticisms that they have, but
It's Twitter, Anne. I think they would tell you criticisms.
yeah, that's yeah, to the kind of broader question of like what I would love to come out of discussions like this is that, you know, I think sometimes I tend to think of Christianity as being very static and unchanging, but it does change so much. Even if the text that we rely on doesn't change, our interpretations of the text change. And even in very, I mean, to use the example of Mary Magdalene and the Catholic Church, which is very slow to change, but even within Catholicism, they have moved away from older interpretations of Mary Magdalene and now officially refer to her as the apostle to the apostles, and have changed the reading done in church on her feast day. So even in this very static patriarchal establishment, there is small and slow change, which I find very encouraging, and I'd love to see more of that.
Am I heard?
Yeah, we can hear you.
With respect, that's still from your point of view, and fair enough. What I was wondering was, what is seen from the outside? What is the picture that's being received, not the intentional picture that you hope but what is the actual picture that is being received? Is it a new version of spirituality? Is it a revised version of Christianity? What are the, is it Butler Bass's version or some variant on that? Is it, what is it that the outside world with very little knowledge of the details of Christianity or really what it's getting at, what are they hearing and seeing from what is being said here? In other words, is it really a communication or is it talk among the choir?
I think it's one of the things I think that keeps me rooted in my work as a pastor. That a lot of the time I would rather do literally anything else in the world than work in a church. And what I tell people is that if MCC Toronto, where I work now, reminded me of any other church ever that I've been to, I couldn't work there. And the only reason I can stay on their payroll is that it's not like any other church I've ever been to. And I hope to never work in another church that reminds me of another church again. Because I just don't like church anymore. The experiences have been too bad, but I don't know what else to do with my life. And that's a whole other very difficult, if somebody has an idea for another career after 20 something years and a seminary degree, please reach out. I digress. But one of the things that keeps me in this work is that I think it's important, just as our podcast presents a narrative and a counter narrative, those of us who still can stomach the label Christian need to present a counter narrative to the world, because those who are the loudest and those who get the most media attention and popular attention are creating this narrative that Christianity is inherently patriarchal, homophobic, transphobic, xenophobic, colonialist, white supremacist. And we're all a little bit of those things, and a lot of us have to deconstruct and work on further deconstructing those things. But it's important for me to say, and for any of us to say, that there are other ways to be Christian in the world than the loudest voices would have you believe. Like when somebody says, like so many public figures are doing, unfortunately, like professional athletes, in the last year have and people like in Target in the United States are saying, well, I can't support Pride because I'm a Christian. Well, I support trans rights because I'm a Christian. It is an act of faith for me. And my Christianity is every bit as valid as theirs, and maybe even more so. I don't like to get into that kind of contest, but I am a queer, trans, Christian woman pastor, and all of that makes perfect sense in my head, that I cannot be a Christian apart from my transness. I can't understand God apart from my transness. And so, to those folks that are creating that narrative that say, well, I don't agree with, transgenderism or people being LGBTQ or people being progressive or feminist because I'm a Christian, we have to say, no, we are all those things because of our faith. Even if we don't get to be the louder voices, and even if being visible and being outspoken is exhausting and traumatic and makes me want to run away on a regular basis, I don't want to get to the end of my life having been given a platform to model this, authentic and enlivening and open way of being Christian, and not having taken advantage of that platform.
You're here.
So I don't know what people are seeing when they see somebody like me. I often say, I am, a basic suburban hockey mom or a sign of the apocalypse, depending on who you ask. But I hope that that folks are seeing some of the good in what we're doing.
And I have to say, for me, listening to this podcast and all the content was very actually healing. And I know I'm inside baseball on this because I was part of it. But I didn't know what the content was going to be. I didn't know what was going to be said. But I have a lot of religious trauma from my upbringing, and a lot of regrets from my upbringing and in the church. And this podcast helped me to see what I had been taught was not the only way to see things, and that there were stories in the Bible that I could relate to finally. And that was, it shook me, to be totally honest. I have always had a huge resistance against theology. And because of what I have grown up with and the pain that it has caused me as well. And June, not even, can't even imagine yours. I don't want to diminish anything you've just said. I'm just saying that for me, it was truly in my little world, it was healing for me and opened my mind to a new way to look at it. And that, again, this is from the insider. I'm really hoping that for others, there's inclusivity and openness and just a general sense of, oh, I relate to that story and I could learn something from that. And it doesn't alienate me. I felt so alienated, I think, by the church for so long. And this was the first thing I think I read or was part of theologically that I felt a connection to.
Michael has to get going, so we're going to say goodbye to Michael. Thank you for being here and appreciate it. Have a great night. Alan,
thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks so much. Alan, you've had your hand up for quite some time, so I don't want to forget to call on you.
Thank you. I just want to say that I followed the link to the Diana Butler-Bass's sermon at the Imagine Wild Goose conference and listened to it, and I thought it was amazing. And discussing the historical background to the Greek transcripts of the New Testament and John chapters 11 and 12, and a reference to Elizabeth Schrader's amazing research. And I just found that was fascinating. I really, really enjoyed it. And thank you so much.
That's great. Yeah, that's the sermon that went viral. Doesn't happen too often with sermons, but that one did. Does anybody else have a comment that they just want to make sure they get in before we say goodnight, or a question or any other thing to share? Okay. Well, in that case, I'm going to say goodnight. Thank you so much, everyone, for staying an extra half hour to chat. It's been really wonderful, and it's been a great discussion. So thank you for coming, and have a great rest of your evening. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.